1991, southern Iraq. The horizon trembled under a gray haze of heat and sand. Through the thermal scopes of an M1 Abrams tank, the desert shimmered in black and white silhouettes, 50 meters to the left. Another Abrams moved into firing position. The radio crackled enemy armor ahead. Across the flat desert floor, the unmistakable silhouettes of T-72 tanks emerged. The Iraqi crews trained under Soviet doctrine spread out, initiated firing protocols, and took aim. To them, it was the perfect ambush. They believed their 125 mm smoothbore guns and frontal armor gave them a fighting chance. Soviet engineers had promised as much. They were wrong. The American commander gave a single order. The gunner locked on. A 40-pound sabot round accelerated out of the barrel at over 5,000 feet per second. A second later, the lead T-72 detonated not from an ammo cook-off, but from something far worse. The depleted uranium penetrator hadn't just pierced the armor, it had liquefied it. To Soviet-trained observers embedded with the Iraqi units, it seemed like a glitch in reality. The round had gone straight through the tank, like a hot knife through wax. The turret launched skyward. The chassis burned white-hot. The second T-72 tried to reverse. It didn't get far. Another Abrams fired, and another explosion lit the desert like a signal flare from hell. This wasn't a firefight. It was a razor. Behind Soviet lines thousands of miles away, engineers monitoring satellite feeds watched with confusion. No tank should be capable of that kind of kill. Not at that range, not that cleanly. They scrambled for answers. New chemical warheads, lasers were the Americans using experimental charges. None of the theories made sense. Back on the battlefield, the Abrams crews pushed forward unopposed now. Every T-72 they encountered ended the same way, pierced, burning, irrelevant. The Americans called them turkey shoots. But in Moscow, it was something else, a full-spectrum panic. Because for all their simulations, all their metallurgy, all their armor theories, nothing had prepared Soviet engineers for a tank round that ignored steel, composite, and even reactive plating. Nothing had prepared them for what depleted uranium could do. And by the time they understood it, the battlefield had already been decided. In the years leading up to Desert Storm, Soviet armored doctrine rested on a simple, unshakable belief armor, stops penetration. The T-72's frontal hull and turret were designed to withstand NATO's best shots. The armor matrix combined rolled homogeneous steel, composite fillers, and later, explosive reactive tiles. Field tests in Kharkiv and Kubinka reinforced the view nothing short of high-explosive anti-tank heat warheads at point-blank range could reliably punch through. The M1 series, the U.S. Army's tank-killing sabot round, was known to Soviet engineers, on paper. It was dangerous but manageable. They had calculated its penetration against Soviet armor using old metrics, not realizing the numbers were based on assumptions from the 1970s. Worse, they believed the U.S. would never widely deploy such rounds due to environmental concerns, production cost, and barrel wear. Those assumptions were fatal. In 1991, the M1 nicknamed the Silver Bullet, was standard issue for M1 Abrams crews. Its core, a depleted uranium rod longer, denser, and faster than anything the Soviets had ever imagined, being fielded in mass quantities. When fired, the round didn't just penetrate, it self-sharpened. The DU rod would shear away layers of itself upon impact, maintaining a needle-sharp point that sliced through armor like molten glass. Soviet analysts had never tested against that. Their armor simulators didn't account for DU's pyrophoric properties, its tendency to ignite on contact with air. When a DU penetrator hit a tank, it didn't just punch through. It superheated the interior, igniting fuel, ammunition, and even the air inside. Survivability dropped to zero. Reports from Iraqi tank crews began arriving entire T-72 formations, destroyed before they could return fire. Soviet advisors embedded with Republican Guard units reported that rounds were hitting T-72s from over 2 kilometers away, well outside the T-72's effective engagement range. Some tank turrets were found over 30 meters from the hulls, with clean entry holes on one side and gaping exit wounds on the other. In Moscow, disbelief turned to quiet dread. The USSR had spent decades developing the T-72 as its export backbone, a workhorse of the Warsaw Pact. Now, in a matter of hours, the myth of its invincibility was unraveling, and worst of all, no one had seen it coming. Not because the threat was invisible, but because Soviet engineers had assumed the enemy would follow the same rules of war they did. They were wrong, and the battlefield had no sympathy for old assumptions. The Soviet concept of armored warfare, so deeply ingrained into Warsaw Pact strategy, relied on overwhelming force, concentrated assault groups, and robust, affordable tanks. The T-72 was never designed to be the best tank. It was designed to be good enough in massive numbers. Soviet planners believed that numerical superiority and solid frontal armor would offset NATO's technological edge. Their doctrine didn't account for precision fire at extreme range. It didn't expect engagements to be decided before the second tank could even return fire. Most of all, it never predicted that American tankers would operate with near-instant targeting feedback through digital fire control systems and thermal sights. In Soviet war colleges, the model battle was fought in Central Europe, masses of T-72s charging through the Fulda Gap, taking losses but closing in on U.S. and West German positions. If a few tanks were hit at long range, it didn't matter. The goal was always to survive the initial salvos, close the distance, and crush defenders through sheer mass. But the Gulf War made a mockery of that playbook. When U.S. M1 Abrams tanks opened fire in Iraq, they did so from distances that shattered Soviet engagement theory, 3,000 meters, sometimes farther. At that range, T-72s couldn't see, couldn't aim, couldn't even detect their attackers on radar or visual. The Americans weren't fighting a battle. They were conducting a firing range test, and the targets didn't fire back. The Soviet obsession with cost-effective mass had created a generation of tanks vulnerable to a new kind of warfare. The T-72 lacked the electronics, sensors, and stabilization systems of the Abrams. Its autoloader was faster but less safe. Its armor was thicker but not smarter. Its gunners were trained in visual tracking, not thermal identification. And most damning of all, its steel was meant to absorb tungsten, not uranium. In the bowels of Soviet military institutes, frantic studies began reverse engineering battle reports, analyzing infrared signatures, testing degraded steel under simulated impact. They found no easy fix. To match the Abrams, they would have to reinvent their tanks, not just upgrade a turret or add reactive armor, but rethink the entire relationship between firepower, survivability, and sensor fusion. But it was already too late, because on the battlefield, doctrine doesn't get second chances. And for the Soviet T-72, the war it was built for never arrived. Instead, it faced something far worse, a war it didn't understand. Against a weapon it couldn't stop, guided by a system it never saw coming. The first reports sounded like fabrication. Abrams tanks firing from 3 kilometers away, scoring one-shot kills through frontal armor. To Soviet engineers, these were tactical impossibilities. Even advanced Sabot rounds were not expected to achieve clean penetrations at those distances. especially against T-72s equipped with Contact 1 reactive armor. But the reports didn't stop. They multiplied. The impossible event unfolded on the 26th of February, 1991. During the Battle of 73 Easting, a U.S. tank platoon encountered a dug-in Iraqi armored battalion. The terrain was flat, the visibility poor. It should have been a fair fight, ambushes on both sides, close-quarters fire. Instead, the Abrams units destroyed over 30 enemy vehicles in under 20 minutes. Most were T-72s. None returned fire effectively. U.S. forces suffered no losses. Forward observers noted the bizarre pattern. T-72s appeared to explode before their guns elevated. Some turrets launched into the air, others were simply obliterated. Infrared footage captured glowing white flashes where reactive armor failed to stop kinetic penetrators. Soviet observers, embedded with Iraqi officers, could not explain it. Some accused the Iraqis of incompetence. Others assumed classified warheads were in play. But the real answer was simpler and more terrifying. The M829A1 depleted uranium round was striking with such velocity that explosive tiles never triggered. The kinetic energy vaporized steel faster than explosive fillers could react. The DU penetrators ignored the very concept of conventional defense. After-action analysis showed a pattern Iraqi tank crews that had trained under Soviet doctrine reacted as they were taught. Spot the flash, rotate the turret, return fire, but at Abrams engagement ranges, the flash was also the kill shot. There was no counterfire, no warning, just obliteration. In Moscow, engineers tested DU penetrators against mock T-72 hulls under lab conditions. The result was the same penetration angles previously deemed impossible were not just achievable, they were repeatable. Worse, DU's incendiary effect meant that even non-critical hits could ignite ammo racks, detonate fuel, or incapacitate the crew through heat and shrapnel. This broke everything. The armored calculus the Soviets had trusted for decades was inverted overnight. The tank that was meant to anchor the Warsaw Pact had been reduced to mobile shrapnel, and the Americans weren't even using their newest round yet. The initial intelligence briefings delivered to Soviet defense ministries were met with blank stares, not because the data was unclear, but because it defied every principle they had trained under. Reports of T-72s being destroyed at standoff distances were dismissed as battlefield exaggeration. Senior officers blamed Iraqi incompetence, poor maintenance, or even friendly fire. At a closed-door session inside the Ministry of Defense, Soviet General Staff reviewed intercepted U.S. after-action reports. The numbers didn't lie. Over 250 Iraqi tanks, most of them T-72 variants, had been destroyed, many in the first engagements. American losses, near zero. It wasn't a battle. It was execution. Marshal Valentin Varenikov, a hardened veteran of Afghanistan, reportedly muttered, "This isn't warfighting. This is something else." His words weren't defiance. They were confusion. The entire Soviet approach to armored warfare relied on survivability through mass. The T-72 was supposed to endure losses, not evaporate on contact. Moscow dispatched advisors to Iraq to recover damaged tanks for analysis. What they found was devastating. Many turrets had been torn free, not by ammunition cook-offs, but by overpressure shock waves. Penetrations that began cleanly left hulls ruptured like open cans. On some wrecks, the crew hatches were fused shut from internal heat. Skeptics in the Soviet armor design bureaus proposed alternate theories. One claimed the UE was using experimental top-attack munitions. Another blamed precision-guided cluster bombs, misreported as tank fire. But field data didn't support those ideas. Infrared video showed kinetic projectiles hitting side and frontal armor directly. These weren't flukes. They were consistent. Soviet scientists finally had to confront a term they had previously dismissed as Western bravado-depleted uranium. They had known about its density. They had heard whispers about U.S. testing in the 1980s, but they believed it was too difficult to manufacture in quantity, too corrosive on gun barrels, too controversial for wartime use. And now they learned the truth. The U.S. had not only adopted DU for war, they had mass-produced it, fielded it, and built a doctrine around it. The Soviet Union had nothing equivalent. Tungsten rounds were their best option, but even the best Soviet Sabot projectiles degraded at range. They shattered under stress. Do, by contrast, self-sharpen, burned on impact, and kept its core shape through multiple layers of steel. The psychological impact within Soviet military circles was profound. T-72 crews had trained with the understanding that frontal armor could save them. Now, every engagement showed the opposite. Tank commanders began referring to the M1A1 not as a vehicle, but as a death sentence. By the spring of 1991, as the USSR stumbled into economic collapse, its generals were facing a military one just as severe. The tank that had once symbolized Soviet industrial strength had been rendered obsolete by a single American round, and Moscow couldn't deny it any longer. In the weeks following the Gulf War, a new theory began circulating among Soviet defense analysts. The Abrams dominance wasn't due to its gun or armor, but its crew training. It was a comforting idea, one that suggested the T-72 might still be viable if only operated by better soldiers. Soviet war planners latched onto it. They claimed the Iraqi army had been poorly prepared, that its tank crews were rushed through training, barely familiar with gunnery principles, and never drilled under combat conditions. If the same tanks had been crewed by Warsaw Pact veterans, the results might have been different. The theory gained traction because it allowed Moscow to avoid the more painful truth that their hardware itself was obsolete. If training was the problem, it could be fixed with time, with doctrine, with control. Weapons didn't need to change. People did. But then the test data came in. Captured T-72s shipped back to Moscow showed catastrophic failures under stress testing, even under simulated combat conditions. Contact 1 reactive armor failed to stop DU penetrators. On frontal hits, the armor eroded almost instantly. On side impacts, the outcome was total destruction. Engineers found that even high-explosive anti-tank heat protection, an old Soviet strength, was useless against the kinetic energy of American sabots. More damning, field simulations demonstrated that even perfectly executed crew drills would not have saved Iraqi tanks. At 3,000 meters, the T-72's fire control system simply couldn't track or engage a moving Abrams with any reliability. Its optics were inferior, its targeting analog, and its stabilization limited. Worse still, the tank's signature on thermal sensors was massive. In the cold desert night, T-72s glowed like beacons through American gunner sights, while the Abrams remained practically invisible until it fired. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with crew discipline. Still, Soviet brass clung to the theory because the alternative required rewriting the entire future of armored warfare. If the T-72 was truly obsolete, then hundreds of thousands of Warsaw Pact tanks would need replacement. The economy, already unraveling, couldn't support it, so the narrative of bad crews endured, enshrined in internal memos and quiet briefings. But it didn't last long. When Russian tank commanders returning from Syria decades later began encountering American-supplied anti-tank systems and thermal imaging, they realized the truth. What had happened in 1991 wasn't a fluke. It was the new normal. The wrong theory had bought comfort, but it cost them decades of advancement. The tank, once the centerpiece of Soviet power, had become a liability, and no amount of crew discipline could save it from a round that punched through steel like paper. Even as evidence mounted that T-72s were hopelessly outmatched, a second theory emerged in Soviet defense circles, this one far more dangerous. It argued that the M1A1's victories stemmed not from technical superiority, but from favorable conditions, air superiority, satellite targeting, and U.S. battlefield control. According to this view, the Abrams wasn't an inherently superior platform. It was just well supported. Remove the AWACS coverage, strip away satellite-guided fire missions, deny the Americans control of the skies, and the tank would be just another armored vehicle, vulnerable to close-quarters ambushes and missile strikes. This theory appealed to Soviet pride. It meant the T-72 could still dominate in a true tank versus tank war. The problem wasn't the machine, it was the environment. Change the terrain, disrupt U.S. air dominance, and the balance would return. So Soviet planners ran simulations. They modeled a conflict in the Fulda Gap, with NATO and Warsaw Pact forces colliding in Central Europe under dense cloud cover, high jamming, and no air dominance. In that narrow scenario, they found something they could cling to parity. But reality intervened. Gulf War footage showed Abrams units operating without KS close air support, often far ahead of friendly lines. They advanced through sandstorms, fog, and smoke, and still maintained kill ratios above 10-1. T-72s were being knocked out in conditions that should have neutralized the U.S. support structure. Moreover, Soviet engineers began encountering another terrifying detail. The U.S. tank's performance didn't degrade in bad conditions, it improved. The Abrams thermal sights pierced fog and smoke. Its stabilized optics remained accurate over rough terrain. Its turret traversed quickly, independent of hull movement. The second wrong theory unraveled when a recovered T-72M from Iraq was analyzed alongside its digital U.S. counterparts. The disparity wasn't just in support, it was in design philosophy. The Abrams was built around information dominance, the T-72 around numerical mass. Even without GPS or satellite support, the Abrams could acquire, track, and destroy targets with chilling precision. Soviet doctrine assumed tanks would fight in battalion strength. The Americans had proven one platoon could wipe out a company if the range and optics were on their side. By 1992, internal Soviet memorandums began quietly, recommending a halt to T-72 exports. Countries like India and Syria, longtime clients, were beginning to ask hard questions. Some even inquired about licensing U.S. optics. The myth of environmental superiority had cracked. The second wrong theory, like the first, had bought time, not answers. In truth, the Americans had changed the rules of armored warfare. The battlefield was no longer about massed steel and coordinated artillery. It was about who saw first, and the T-72 built in the image of a past war was now completely blind. In retrospect, the Soviet failure to understand just how lethal the M1A1 Abrams had become wasn't just a tactical oversight, it was a systemic breakdown of military intelligence. For decades, the KGB, GRU, and military-industrial complex had tracked U.S. tank development. They had thousands of files, photographs, blueprints stolen from contractors. And yet, when Operation Desert Storm began, they were blindsided. The core of the failure was this: the Soviets believed their information was complete. They had extensive data on the original M1 Abrams, including its armor composition, engine performance, and gun system. But what they didn't know, what American secrecy had masterfully concealed, was the revolution happening inside those tanks. New thermal sights, digital fire control systems, high-speed data links, depleted uranium armor inserts, ammunition that didn't just defeat Soviet armor, it annihilated it. When Soviet intelligence analysts reviewed satellite photos of pre-deployment staging areas in Saudi Arabia, they spotted the Abrams tanks but assessed them as limited improvement over older models. The assumption that the M1 was too heavy, too fuel-dependent, and too slow for sustained operations. One report even predicted severe logistical problems would force the U.S. to slow its advance by day 3. By day 3, Abrams platoons were 100 kilometers inside Iraq, tearing through Republican guard lines. Soviet agents embedded in Iraq tried to provide real-time updates, but even those messages were flawed. Iraqi officers, reluctant to admit they were being slaughtered, blamed desertion, friendly fire, even mechanical failure. The truth that their best tanks were being destroyed from miles away by invisible American gunners was too shameful to admit over open channels. Meanwhile, Soviet radar installations in the Caucasus try to intercept communications between U.S. command units and tank battalions. But the data was encrypted and relayed by satellites. No useful traffic came through. The Soviets knew an offensive was underway, but they had no idea what was happening at the ground level. By the time physical wreckage was recovered, it was too late. Soviet engineers found burnt-out T-72 hulls, penetrated cleanly through frontal plates. They recovered turret fragments thrown 30 meters by internal detonations. Some tanks had never returned fire. The Iraqi crews were dead before they saw their attackers. The most damning piece of evidence came from a recovered Abrams round that had failed to detonate, likely due to poor storage or sand contamination. Inside, Soviet metallurgists found the unmistakable fingerprints of depleted uranium. The projectile was heavier than expected, its tip fused with exotic alloys, and its shape engineered to pierce armor through pure kinetic force. For the first time, Soviet intelligence understood they had underestimated not just a tank, but an entire generation of Yule technological warfare. The intelligence failure wasn't in what they knew. It was in what they didn't even know they had missed. And by then, the Abrams wasn't a threat on paper, it was a battlefield ghost. One that left behind only fire, smoke, and questions that the Soviet Union could no longer afford to answer. The M1 Abrams wasn't a fluke. It wasn't just a powerful tank, it was the spearhead of an entirely new way of war. The Soviets had always assumed the Americans would fight with overwhelming numbers, sheer firepower, and brute force. But Desert Storm revealed something else entirely. A system, integrated, lethal, relentless. From the moment American forces crossed into Iraq, everything moved with synchronized precision. Satellites fed data to AWACS aircraft, which relayed targeting solutions to ground units. Apache helicopters scouted ahead, identifying enemy armor concentrations within minutes. Those coordinates were passed to tank platoons equipped with onboard digital mapping systems and encrypted radios. By the time a T-72 rolled over a dune, 3 separate U.S. platforms already had it in their sights. And at the heart of that system was the Abrams. Its fire control computer didn't just calculate range, it adjusted for crosswinds, barrel temperature, and vehicle movement in real time. A gunner could lock onto a moving target while the tank was in full motion. Fire, and hit within a meter. Night or day, smoke or dust, distance was no longer a barrier. The 120mm smoothbore cannon, loaded with depleted uranium sabot rounds, could kill from 3,000 meters, and often did. But what terrified the Soviets wasn't just the weapon. It was the doctrine. American forces didn't rely on massed formations or rigid orders. Units operated semi-independently, with mission-type tactics that empowered sergeants and lieutenants to make lethal decisions on the fly. Soviet commanders, used to hierarchical command structures, were stunned by the fluidity of U.S. armored assaults. Entire battalions would pivot directions based on satellite data. Convoys rerouted themselves mid-march to avoid minefields. Artillery support was summoned with pinpoint accuracy in under 5 minutes. It was decentralized warfare executed with centralized vision. Even the Abrams vulnerabilities had been accounted for. Fuel hungry. Yes, but backed by the most robust logistics network in military history. Heavy certainly, but delivered en masse across oceans by C-5 Galaxies and Sea-Lift command vessels. And when maintenance was needed, American forward repair teams restored battle-damaged tanks in hours, not days. To the Soviets, it was alien. Where their doctrine emphasized redundancy and attrition, the Americans emphasized agility and precision. Every Abrams was not just a tank, it was a node in a warfighting web, sharing information, reacting in real time, and striking before the enemy even knew what was coming. Captured Republican Guard officers, once trained by Soviet advisors, admitted they never saw the Abrams until it fired. In one engagement near Basra, a company of Iraqi tanks was wiped out in under 6 minutes. Only 2 shells struck U.S. armor, both bounced off. And above it all, Soviet analysts realized, was the horror of obsolescence. The T-72 had been their pride, their export jewel, their standard bearer. Now, it was just another smoking carcass in the desert. The American system, its weapons, its doctrine, its people, had rewritten armored warfare, and for Soviet generals, the realization was as stark as it was final. They hadn't lost a battle. They'd lost an era. The final humiliation didn't come from a massive set-piece battle or a prolonged slugfest. It came from the utter lack of one. In February 1991, as the ground offensive of Operation Desert Storm roared into motion, the Republican Guard braced for a conventional tank engagement. Instead, they were annihilated in hours. On February 25th, near the Iraqi town of Medina, a battalion of M1 Abrams tanks from the U.S. 1st Armored Division engaged what was supposed to be one of Iraq's most elite armored brigades. It wasn't even close. The Iraqis had the terrain advantage. They had more tanks on paper. They had Soviet advisors' playbooks drilled into muscle memory. They also had T-72s tanks that, just years earlier, had been the pride of the Warsaw Pact. And in this battle, they were supposed to hold the line. But the Abrams never gave them a chance. Engagements began at over 2,500 meters, well beyond the effective range of the T-72's fire control. U.S. gunners destroyed multiple enemy tanks before the Iraqis even located the source of the attack. One platoon reported 6 kills in 90 seconds. Several Iraqi tanks never even moved. When the Guard attempted to counterattack, the Abrams 1,500 horsepower gas turbines roared to life, repositioning effortlessly across the desert while maintaining lock on retreating targets. In contrast, Iraqi armor struggled to coordinate. Their communications were jammed. Their formations collapsed. Even Soviet-trained artillery units tried to intervene, launching a barrage on suspected U.S. positions. But the Americans were already gone. A satellite update had come through mid-battle. The entire company pivoted west while counter-battery fire wiped out the Iraqi guns. In the chaos, one Iraqi T-72 unit attempted a desperate flank maneuver. It lasted 4 minutes. Apache helicopters, flying low and fast, launched Hellfire missiles into the formation, from 6 kilometers away. What wasn't killed from above was picked off by Abrams tanks rounding the dunes. When it ended, over 30 T-72s were destroyed. No American tank was lost. Soviet advisors embedded in command posts were stunned into silence. Their strategies, mass, positioning, shock hadn't just failed. They'd never even had time to function. The Americans hadn't played by the rules. They'd changed the game. What truly humiliated the Soviets wasn't just the loss, it was the efficiency, the speed, the precision. Every T-72 destroyed in that battle was a symbol of decades of Soviet industrial pride, and each burning wreck was proof of how obsolete that pride had become. One Soviet advisor reportedly muttered, "They weren't fighting tanks. They were fighting the future." Footage from the aftermath, captured by news crews and broadcast globally, showed eerie rows of wrecked Iraqi armor, most of them with clean penetration holes and zero signs of American damage. Moscow tried to downplay the outcome. State-run media claimed that poor Iraqi leadership, not superior American weapons, was to blame, but the battlefield told a different story. And for those who had spent their careers building and exporting the myth of Soviet armored invincibility, the Medina Ridge encounter wasn't just a defeat, it was an execution. The destruction of Soviet-built armor in the deserts of Iraq was more than a tactical disaster. It was a collapse of military faith. For decades, the T-72 symbolized the industrial might of the Warsaw Pact, a tank fueled by allies from East Germany to North Korea. Its reputation, carefully built through exercises, propaganda, and battlefield myth, was eviscerated in less than a week. In underground command centers and offices across Moscow, the reaction was swift and grim. Classified footage smuggled through foreign press or intercepted by Soviet surveillance showed M1 Abrams tanks firing on the move, shrugging off hits, and emerging untouched. Soviet officers watched, rewinding frames in disbelief, trying to understand how their premier tank had been outclassed so totally. But there was no tactical oversight to correct, no strategic error to adjust. The doctrine itself had failed. For the Soviet Union, which had long defined military success through mass and momentum, the American model was unrecognizable. Instead of concentrating thousands of tanks in thunderous charges, the U.S. deployed fewer units, but ones linked by information, precision, and air dominance. The Abrams wasn't just a better tank. It was a weapon that existed in a better system, faster, smarter, adaptive. The impact went beyond military circles. Warsaw Pact nations, already straining under economic collapse and growing discontent, began re-evaluating their defense dependencies. The illusion that Soviet weapons could match or exceed Western counterparts was shattered. NATO, long on the defensive in perception, was suddenly the standard. And with that realization came a shift in allegiance. East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, nations that had paraded T-72s through their capitals on May Day, began dismantling those arsenals, quietly and then publicly. The arms export markets that the Soviet Union dominated shrank overnight. Contracts were canceled. New ones went to the West, inside the Kremlin. Aging generals who had spent their lives perfecting Cold War tank strategies suddenly found themselves irrelevant. Their greatest achievement, building an armored force to rival the West, had been proven not only vulnerable, but obsolete, as one Soviet analyst put it bluntly. We did not lose to tanks. We lost to an idea. That idea was technological superiority, wielded with agility and accuracy. The belief that brains, not just brawn, won battles. The strategic cost, immense. Not only had the Soviets failed to stop the West from demonstrating unchallenged military supremacy, but they'd lost the confidence of their allies and their own military class. In 1991, as the USSR crumbled politically, the ideological spine of its military legacy crumbled alongside it. The battlefield had spoken, and the message was deafening. America's way of war had left the Soviet model in ruins. Today, the skeletal remains of T-72 tanks still litter the desert plains outside Basra and Medina Ridge, oxidized metal tombs from a war that redefined modern combat. Their twisted hulls stand not only as relics of defeat, but as markers of an age when firepower alone was no longer enough. In post-Soviet Russia, the shock of that humiliation lingered for decades. Defense committees quietly abandoned mass production of outdated tank lines. Engineers, once proud architects of steel behemoths, pivoted to survivability and electronics. The entire doctrine that had defined Soviet armored warfare speed, numbers, overwhelming force was rewritten in silence. But the legacy of that collapse still echoes. In American training manuals, the lessons of 1991 remain required reading: precision targeting, overmatch range, and battlefield information dominance are not theories, they're proven, fossilized in every wrecked T-72. The Abrams program, once controversial for its cost, is now seen as one of the most decisive investments in Cold War history. And the DU rounds the tank shells that pierce the myth of Soviet invincibility have become almost mythical themselves. Feared, studied, denounced, but never ignored. For every nation that had once imported Soviet tanks by the trainload, the message was clear armor. Without vision is just a target. Even today, Russian commanders facing the challenges of modern warfare must wrestle with that ghost, the haunting reality that the weapons they trusted most failed when it mattered most. The Gulf War did not just destroy tanks, it destroyed certainty. And in that smoking silence, the United States revealed its most powerful weapon wasn't just the Abrams tank, but the total system behind it. That lesson still reverberates, and every time an Abrams fires from 3 kilometers out, with a hit confirmed before the enemy commander even reacts, the Cold War whispers its final truth. Superiority isn't measured in numbers, it's measured in outcomes.